So we reached day 19 of my cycle tour of northern Spain. I'm now heading back east towards Bilbao and the ferry home, and I'm leaving the coast for the last time as I leave Ribadesella. I think I've got the pronunciation right with the double L that time. I was doing it wrong yesterday. So as we're leaving the coast here, have a look at the mountains ahead. They're basically just this solid wall of mountain I'm cycling at. Now I'm actually cycling along, the road runs along side the river Sala, which is a famous salmon river, and that cuts in a gorge through these mountains. And basically there is about a 40-kilometre solid ridge of mountains that's stretching east from that. That I'm passing through at the moment. This is one of the passes through that. And then beyond that, there are the mountains known as the Picos de Europa, which are the mountains of Europe. And they are very high indeed. The reason they have that name is that they're so high that when Spanish sailors were returning from the Americas, the first land they'd often see would be the top of those mountains, or at least that's according to legend. And they stretch for about 20 kilometres east to west. So this is kind of like two parallel mountain ridges, with the smaller but very substantial one, and you'll get a good look at it tomorrow in front, and then a more substantial one behind it. And so today's cycling is basically along the rivers that cut through these mountains. So I've just switched here from the main road, which is following the river Sella, to this side road, which is following the river Zardon. And this is a little this is a little pass basically within that first really big ridge of mountains. Now the significance of the ridges is, apart from the fact that they're very impressive, was that they create very narrow funnels basically of access to the coast from those interior valleys, and that had a big historic effect, and it's where two major battles in Spanish history took place. So the first of these I'm going to talk about today, and that's right back in the 700s, and the second I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and that's in fact as recent as late 1937-38 during the Spanish Civil War. Now, I'm not exactly sure where the municipal boundaries lie, but this is the Zardon Valley basically, and we're going to be crossing over at the pass at the end of this valley into Onus. So Onus, there's traces of people going back to the Neolithic. This is true of this whole coastline in general, and then because of the terrain again, this forms part of the battlegrounds between the Cantabrian Celts and the Romans, and then later on, as we will see, it becomes a battleground between the Visigoths and the Umayyad Caliphate. So that is the Islamic expansion into Spain and then its contraction. So these valleys, these narrow passes, these high mountains, again and again in Spanish history, the history of the Spanish state, I think, is probably more accurate. A lot of this is pre-Spain, to put it mildly. These formed key terrains for opposing sides to battle over, and you can sort of see why as you're looking at these. They're not inaccessible, but these are extremely steep peaks, with quite narrow roads running along them. Great defensive terrain. Inserting some bird song there. One of the things we miss from the time-lapse footage is the actual noise of what I'm cycling through. And once again, as I'm back in the mountains, that involves an awful lot of bird song. There is some wildlife in the Cantabrian Mountains. I think the bears are extinct from this part. I haven't been seen in a while, but there are some wolves. Didn't see any of them, but if I was going into the Picos themselves, perhaps I would have. The population has fallen of all these rural parts of Spain. It's down, I think, about half or less of what it would have been in the 1970s, and a lot of that population is quite old as younger people have moved to the cities. Anyway, let's go back to our story. So Where we are here is a few kilometres to the east of where a big battle, a significant battle was fought in 722. Whether or not it was big depends on whose chronicles you choose to believe, and that's the Battle of Covadonga. So 722, the actual historical records are quite weak from back then, and there's claims and counterclaims in what are really propagandist documents that don't necessarily match up to the two sides. And there are two sides here, the Visigoths, represented by a guy called Pelagus, and the Umayyad Caliphate. And this is the phase at which the Berbers are in fact quite often the equivalent of aristocrats of the areas of Spain that are ruled. This normally gets told in lots of histories as a battle between the Spanish and the Moors, right? Which doesn't actually make a huge amount of sense on one level, because this was a battle between people living in Spain, and the people ruling the people living in Spain were two rival factions, one of which was both Arabic and Berber in origins, and the other of which was Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths, you're probably going, I've heard of them. Where are they from? And so basically, the Visigoths are one of those Germanic tribes that towards the end of the Western Roman Empire were giving the Romans an awful lot of trouble, getting down to Rome, sacking it, all that sort of thing. They became Christianized, and they basically did a deal with the Romans where they were given Spain, basically, to look after. But where did they actually come from? And the answer to that is they came from the lower Danube. So really, they're coming far, far from the east, and they're coming to Spain to take over as an external ruling class over the Spanish. I don't know if peasant is the right word to use there, but over whatever the indigenous population is at the time. And the same, of course, is true of the Caliphate. Again, I mean, there are settlers coming in as well, and I'm sure the Visigoths also had settlers coming with them, but it's basically a ruling class coming from elsewhere to take over the running of the place, and then there's a fight between those two factions, and the ideology that fight is around is two religions, basically. But for a lot of the period, the people of both those religions are living together, and also the divide between Christian and Muslim is not as simple as it's expressed. And this particular story of the Battle of Covadonga illustrates this. So this is seen as the turning point in the Islamic conquest, and then the reconquest, as it's often phrased. This is the start of the reconquest. It's the foundational event of the Kingdom of Asturias. So this Pelagus, he's a Visigoth nobleman who's been exiled from Toledo by the Visigoth king. And he's probably come to terms with the Arab elite in this vicinity, although again, some of them are Berber, whereby he's permitted to govern locally in the manner of the sort of deals they'd done with previous Visigoths. He rebels for some reason. We don't know what that reason is. And such rebellions against periods are not that unusual. They're a common theme in Visigothic Spain. And the Muslim army is sent against him under the command of Alcama. But here's a key part. It also includes the Christian Bishop of Seville, Opa, who is or was probably the brother of that Visigoth king we mentioned a minute ago. So you have some guy who was previously working with the Arabs, probably tax collecting essentially, and then on the other side you have a Christian bishop. But the story that we get told today becomes this much more simplified version of an ideological struggle between the two of them. It's further complicated because the source of the rebellion was going locally for a number of years. But the battle happened because there'd been an attempt by a caliphate army to cross into France. That had been defeated, was sent home demoralised, and the commander decided that basically, so he came home with a victory under his belt, why didn't he go off and put down this local rebellion? And so he arrived with the bishop, and the bishop tries to arrange a surrender of the fellow Christian population. He fails. Pelagus and his forces retreat deep into the mountains of Asturias, into the Picos, into a narrow valley flanked by mountains, and we're seeing plenty of those, which was easily defensible. And some people say he only had 300 men with him, which sounds suspiciously like a retelling of the Spartan story. but not a huge force. Alcama arrives in Covadonga, sends an envoy to tell Pelagos to surrender. He refuses. He sends his best troops into the valley to fight. The Asturians under Pelagos are shooting at them with arrows and stones from the slopes of the mountains. And then Pelagos leads a charge by some of his soldiers out into the valley. They'd been hiding in the caves, unseen by the Caliphate army. Now, the Christian account of this battle claimed there was slaughter among the Muslims was horrific, and this was this huge victory, while the Umayyad accounts describe it as a mere skirmish. And I think we don't really know which of those is true, and possibly both are slightly true. However, Alcama himself fell in the battle, so generally, if you lose your commander, that's a pretty big deal. And the people in the other villages now emerged with their weapons and killed large amounts of the retreating soldiers. Again, something that often happens in terms of rebellion. So that's kind of the story of that battle. It's commemorated in the shrine, which in the town of Covadonga, which we're not going through. That's the next municipality up. But I think looking at the landscape here, it gives you an appreciation of why it was the centre of a number of these key events. Spanish history is really quite ideological because the Spanish state is to quite an extent quite a fragile construction. There's quite a lot of the different peoples that make it up who would, at least a minority of them, would like to be independent. Sometimes that's a majority. There's been some quite brutal repression of some of those independence movements, and of course even the recent attempts by the Catalans to declare unilateral independence of a few years ago. And certainly the Spanish progressives I've talked to have been quite keen to emphasise that Christians, Jews and Muslims spent a lot of time on a local level living in harmony, and that the expulsions don't necessarily give you anything like the full story of what the history was. I'd be quite interested in a good history of that period. It's quite fragmentary because it's so long ago, so if you've got one to recommend, do post it as a comment, and as usual I encourage people to read both the video descriptions and the comments. We have now crossed over into Cabrales, and we're seeing the Picos de Europa over there on the right hand side of the road. One of my regrets actually with this is that I didn't do this section a bit slower and actually cycled some of those side roads running into the Picos. I had intended to do that originally, but at this stage of the trip I was a bit too exhausted. Oh boy, so that gorge descent, which hopefully comes out all right in the GoPro, caught me totally by surprise. I didn't know it was coming up, and I didn't know how busy the road was because I'd been passed by a few cement trucks, so I spent the whole time going down that going, please let there not be a cement truck right behind me. When you're going fast downhill, so sort of 50k or whatever, the rattle the bike makes sounds a lot like a car behind you, so you can never really tell if there is something back there. But oh my god. So this valley, Cabrales, is basically a gorge between the two sets of mountains I've been talking about, and once we get to Arenas de Cabrales, just down here a little bit further, where I'm going to be spending the night, that's at the point where it really becomes gorge-like from that point onwards. And it was the following day that I believed I would be mostly cycling through this particular gorge. As you might tell from the I believed there, things did not go quite as planned. And if you look carefully, once we arrive at Arenas, just before I turn off towards my hotel, you'll spot something that I should have spotted myself on the day, but failed to, and that is road closed ahead sign. Little video of my latest place, because it's got the biggest bathroom I've seen so far. Look at it, and out there is a view of the mountains. Anyway, I had failed to see that sign, so I had a blissful night wandering around the town, getting myself a fine steak and chips, having a look at the great views and imagining what it was going to be like to cycle down that gorge in the morning. If you've watched the video this far, give the channel a subscribe, give this video a like, and tune in to the next one when we find out everything that's about to go wrong the next day, and there's quite a bit.